This is the beginning of the study of Moses. Why Moses, you ask? First, he's probably the best known character in the Old Testament. And secondly, wasn't it Moses and Elijah that appeared with Jesus when he was transfigured on the mountain in front of Peter, James, and John? That was found in Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9, and 2 Peter chapter 1. If he's good enough for Jesus, he's good enough for me. But most of what people remember of Moses is his bold side. What about his human side, his mistakes and weaknesses? I will hope to cover every part of these studies. Now, if we were to read every verse in the Bible concerning Moses, it would take a long time. I'll read and post many verses. Others I'll paraphrase, and still others I'll summarize the events. So if you're ready, here's part 1, which I call Moses, the resistant leader. Moses stands as the dominant figure of the Old Testament. God chose Moses to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and mediate his covenant with them. Moses handed down the 10 Commandments, then completed his mission by bringing the Israelites to the edge of the Promised Land. Although Moses was inadequate for these monumental tasks, God worked mightily through him, supporting Moses every step of the way. But let's go back to the beginning. Why was it such a time? Let's take a look at how this all began. Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, was sold into slavery by his brothers, only to be bought by Potiphar, head of the Pharaoh's palace guard. Through a series of ups and downs, none because of Joseph's fault, he eventually was elevated to second in command next to Pharaoh. He saved the nation of Egypt and his Israelite family from 3 years of famine. The Pharaoh and the Egyptians were very thankful. But now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly, and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. Times were so bad that to slow the Hebrew population, the midwives were told if the baby born at birth was a boy, they were to kill them. But the midwives did not obey and gave excuses. So Pharaoh gave the order to everyone that any male baby born was to be thrown into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could not hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So Jochebed, Moses' mother, and Miriam, Moses' sister, were able to save Moses. Isn't it interesting that a male baby that was to be killed became a prince of Egypt, and the mother, who disobeyed the command to kill the child, ended up getting paid to nurse her own child? Sometimes you just have to sit in awe how God works out his plan.
Not much is said about the next 35 plus years. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus wrote that Moses was heir to the throne of Egypt, and that while a young man he led armies of Egypt in victorious battles against the Ethiopians. Acts 7:22 says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Remember this part about the words later. Egypt was one of the most academic and scientific societies among the ancient cultures. It is reasonable to think that Moses was instructed in geography, history, grammar, writing, literature, philosophy, and music. Since he was of the royal family, we expect that as Moses went anywhere, he went in a princely chariot, and his guards would cry out, "Bow the knee." If he floated on the Nile, it was in a magnificent ship, with musical accompaniment. He lived a royal life, a life of the rich and famous. This was a custom of the time to bring foreign children into Pharaoh's household, because this was a way of spreading the Egyptian way of life and influence among its smaller neighbors. But it must be assumed that he knew of his origin, because the next verse describes him going out to where his own people were. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. If he thought this act would bring favor in the eyes of his own people, guess again. Acts 7:25 says Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" His own people saw him as the enemy, probably by the way he dressed and how he was presented when he would travel anywhere. How did they know what he was thinking? All they knew was slavery and cruelty. Try to picture yourself as one of the Hebrews. What would you have thought? When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Son or no son, heir to the throne or not, this was not to be overlooked. This goes to show also the mindset of the Pharaoh and what it was like to be under the rule of a dictator. You can see from this map that Midian was quite a distance from Egypt. It must have taken Moses some time to get there. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. Imagine, 7 daughters and no sons. The daughters seemed that they were capable of doing men's work, just not strong enough to fight off these other shepherds. Moses was welcomed into the home of their father, Reuel, also known as Jethro. Reuel was apparently his personal name, which meant friend of God, and Jethro may have been a more official or honorary name. Jethro meant excellence. Jethro was a descendant of Abraham's other children through his second wife, Keturah, who he married after Sarah died. You can read this in Genesis 25, verses 1 and 2. Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses for a wife. For the next 40 years he tended flock as a shepherd. Imagine, talking to sheep for 40 years. Each day was just like the last, for 40 years. I call this next set of slides, Finding Your Identity in God, because that is what Moses had to do. It was not easy for him after talking to sheep for 40 years. So now Moses was about 80 years old and was tending the flock. As was normal for a flock of sheep, you constantly have to be moving them around to find food. So he came upon Mount Oreb, the mountain of God. There he saw a burning bush that was not consumed by the fire. Curious about the bush, he went over to it. God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." A side note here, When I was on a mission trip in South India, we went to church. Before entering the church, we had to remove our sandals. God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now God explained that he had heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt and was ready to rescue them. So in verse 10, "Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Can you imagine what was going through Moses' head right now? Well, the Bible tells us. Excuses, excuses, excuses. Excuse number 1. Who am I? You see, Moses thought he had to do this on his own. Anyone in ministry knows that when you succeed, it wasn't because of you. You really can feel the Holy Spirit working through you. Did you notice that God did not give Moses a pep talk to build up his self-esteem, list his resume, or explain how his last 80 years was a preparation for this task? God's answer is in verse 12. And God said, "I will be with you." What else would you need? Our identity is not found in our job, our skills, our education, performance, possessions, or popularity. These will all fade away or fail. But let's not be too critical of Moses. We know the rest of the story. Moses was just at the beginning and had spent the last 40 years as a simple shepherd. So, excuse number 2. Suppose they ask me, "What is your name?" What should I tell them? God said, "I am who I am." Note that when Jesus said to the Jews in John 8:58, "Before Abraham was born, I am," and that got them really mad because Jesus was calling himself God. Also note in John 18 verses 4 through 6, when Jesus was about to be arrested, he asked the mob who they wanted, and when they said Jesus of Nazareth, he answered, "I am he." They all drew back and fell on the ground. Excuse number 3. What if they don't believe me? God gives an answer and action as proof. What is that in your hand? Throw it to the ground. Moses threw it to the ground, and it became a snake. He ran from it. I would have too. That would really have freaked me out. Then God told him to take it by the tail. It turned back into a staff. Then God told him, "Put your hand inside his cloak." When he took it out, it was leprous. He did it again, and when he brought it out, it was restored. Then God told him, "If they still don't believe, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. It will become blood on the ground." So Moses said, "Oh, that's pretty good." No, he didn't. He came up with another excuse. "I have never been eloquent." Probably not true because of his training in Egypt. Acts 7:22 said that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was powerful in both speech and action. However, how can you practice your speech when all you talk to is sheep for 40 years? God's answer was that he would help Moses speak and teach him what to say. Well, it wasn't good enough. Moses had one more comment. "Oh Lord, please send someone else." Moses really didn't want to go. Have you ever been given a task that from the beginning you really didn't want to do it, so you kept coming up with excuses until you hit the limit? Moses just hit the limit. At this point, God's anger burned against Moses, not a good thing, and Moses realized it. Moses' brother Aaron would be the speaker. God would tell Moses, and Moses would tell Aaron what to say. I heard somewhere that God never calls us to do small things. He doesn't say, "I have a little task for you." I also read somewhere that the greater the task, the longer the preparation. Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's court, and the other 40 years in the desert as a shepherd. Who better to go into Pharaoh's court and then lead the Israelites for another 40 years in the desert? Aaron was told to go into the desert to meet Moses, and Moses told Aaron all that the Lord had said. So how about some closing thoughts here? First of all, what do you think God saw in Moses? What do you think he might see in you? What do you think God may be calling you to do? How would you react? Moses was reluctant and had a lot of excuses. Does that strike you in any way? How does Moses' reaction at first make you feel? What do you think made him change his mind? Does that give you any relief?